Well, good evening, everyone. So, anything happened on the presidential front in the last week? I assure you we will be discussing those events and those doings-on in the days, months, probably years to come. Please, if you have questions, send them our way and store them up, because I'm sure we're going to be doing a couple of snap things as things move incredibly rapidly. I'm sorry? No, we're all trying not to drown at this moment. So, in any event, thank you all for coming out this evening to yet again another series in our series of presidential memoirs, history, and trying to understand America's past by looking back with a critical eye. Is a wonderful thing to see all these people out, especially on such a busy national news day. I'm going to take just a moment to remind you, before I introduce our speaker, that we are, of course, as I say every time, doing our wonderful D-Day trip this year, which I encourage you. Information is on our website, and you can also pick up a flyer on the way out. 9 days traveling with historians, what could be better, traveling with historians and students around England and France exploring D-Day, and it's a wonderful opportunity to get to spend more time with students and, frankly, to support the Student Scholarship Fund that we have to facilitate that. We also have our new Article 2 Society, essentially our way to help the center grow, if you will. You will be getting information about that, if you have not already, in the actual mail, which shows we're a history center, I guess. And if you are interested in more information about that, there's our flyers out in the front as well, and I encourage you to take a gander at that. There's some wonderful opportunities involved. Now, without further ado, our speaker tonight is Professor Matt Sutton, who is the Edward R. Mayer Distinguished Professor of History at Washington State University. He is also, unfortunately for him, the chair of the department at Washington. Yeah, that was supposed to be funny. You've never been a department chair, apparently. So he is the chair of the Department of History at Washington State. I was intending to say complimentary and nice things until I recalled that whereas I went to the University of Wisconsin, Matt got his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Yeah, let that sink in. Who is the smart one now? But nonetheless, he is the author of 5 books on American history and American Christianity in particular, focusing really on American evangelicalism, even more specific than that. He is also no stranger, of course, to the Center for Presidential History, having co-edited, along with Darren Dochuk, a book, Faith in a New Millennium, which you may recall was part of a conference that was sponsored here at our center a few years ago. If you're interested in the way that faith and Christianity in particular are intersecting with American politics, this is a wonderful primer to pick up, and, you know, nice cover too, Oxford University Press. And he has held visiting chairs in Ireland and in Germany, several in Germany, in fact. He's been a National Endowment for the Humanities public scholar, and he's also been a Guggenheim Fellow among a series of other awards. He's also, interestingly enough, writing right now a broad synthetic history of American Christianity, a topic which has not really found its proper historian until now. So that's something that I think we're all looking forward to, you know, once you get home, I guess. So tonight, he's going to be presenting us his current book, just out this week, Double Crossed: The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. If you'll please join me in welcoming Professor Sutton.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I saw there was food in the lobby, and I know at Washington State University, if we want students at an event, we put out free food. So I suspect most of you are students, it looks like, in the audience. Thank you, Jeff, for the warm welcome. I really want to thank Jeff and the Center for Presidential History, Center for Presidential History for having me out, as well as the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. It's really fun to do these kinds of events, and I'm really grateful to be here and that you all were able to come out. Also, one piece of advice, if any of you are would-be authors hoping to publish a book, Having it released the same week as the beginning of an impeachment hearing is not a good idea. But what I can promise you is for the next 40 minutes, I will not say Hunter Biden or Donald Trump or impeachment. We will talk about spies, though, probably not any traitors. Let me begin by talking about Jean le Carré, the famous novelist who writes about spies. In one of his books, his main character, Alex Lemus, asked a rhetorical question. Lemus said, "What do you think spies are? Priests, saints, and martyrs?" And the answer to that question was, of course, no. But what I've discovered is that during World War II, priests and saints were spies, and some even became martyrs. But their stories have remained almost entirely hidden, buried deep in dusty archives or behind the CIA's firewalls. Only in recent years has the CIA declassified the information I'm going to be talking about tonight. And what I've been able to do is to triangulate the materials from the CIA's archives with other materials held in missionary collections or private papers, or in some cases, talking to the children of these missionary agents themselves. And so that was what became this book, Double Crossed. What I learned in the course of this research was that during World War II, American leaders were beginning to learn for the first time how to navigate the complex ways in which religion was shaping global events, was shaping world events, and particularly was shaping the conflict of World War II. And what they were trying to do was figure out how to use religion to their advantage, what ways in which religion functioned in the war, and what it meant for American statecraft and American policymaking. And this is stuff that's been in the archives, but historians have mostly ignored it. They just haven't taken religion seriously enough. And so what I've tried to do is explain why religion mattered and how it influenced the way World War II unfolded. So to do that, I focus on the Office of Strategic Services, and I'll talk about what that is in a second. But working for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was the secret army of priests, religious executives, ministers, and at least one rabbi. And they didn't plan their efforts. They didn't coordinate it. There wasn't any top-down government effort to say, we need to go recruit a bunch of religious activists and turn them into spies. It's just what happened over the course of the war. As many of you probably know, the U.S. was not a major military power on the eve of World War II. The U.S. had no foreign intelligence agency. And so what happens during the war is everybody is essentially fumbling around trying to figure out how to get information on their enemies and how to make the best use of that information. And so that's what led to the creation of the OSS and then the recruitment of these missionaries and missionary executives and other religious activists. And what I end up arguing in the book is that during the war, for the first time probably in American history, we see missionaries and their agendas lining up directly with the U.S. military and the U.S. state. That there's been lots of literature about missionaries in the 19th century and the ways in which their efforts helped open the door for the United States, for American trade, for American expansion, for American diplomatic relations. But there was always a pretty clear wall between the missionaries and the diplomatic corps. World War II erased that wall. For the first time, we had missionaries carrying guns and, in fact, planting bombs, trying to kill their enemies, for the same purposes that the U.S. government was doing those things, which was to win the war. Their agenda, the missionaries' agenda, and the agenda of the Roosevelt administration merged almost perfectly, almost seamlessly. And so their actions made overt and explicit what in earlier generations had been more subtle and more implicit. And it demonstrated the significance of American Protestant power and the significance of the war to American Protestants and to their ability to conduct their work abroad, especially as they looked at the potential of a Hitler victory or a Japanese victory. The other things I found, and what I'll talk about briefly at the very end tonight, is that two of the missionary spies I'm going to talk about ended up being instrumental in laying the foundations for the CIA. As many of you probably know, the CIA was founded in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. But two of the folks who were instrumental to the OSS's efforts during the war were at the foundation of the CIA, and they learned from their World War II experience to do that. The second thing that these missionary spies did was they provided American leaders with a playbook, and particularly the CIA with a playbook for using religion during the Cold War, and then perhaps in the War on Terror as well. They demonstrated how important it was to use religious activists to help achieve American goals. The CIA also learned during World War II, or from what happened during World War II, the importance of using religious organizations and even fake religious organizations. That the CIA has created these fictitious organizations for the purposes of delegitimizing communism in the 1950s, for example. And that was learning from what had happened during World War II. And then finally, one of the things historians have paid a lot of attention to is the ways in which Truman used religion to wage the Cold War, right? It wasn't just a Cold War against a rival economic system, but it was a Cold War against godless communism. And to wage that war, Truman reached out to the Vatican, he reached out to Muslim leaders, he reached out to Jewish leaders. And what I found was that those relationships began during World War II. It was the missionary spies that I studied who were the ones who made those first inquiries and developed those first relationships with the centers of global religious power. So all of this story, in terms of what goes on over the course of the 20th century, really has its origins in World War II. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I should also mention, I'm going to try something I haven't done before since the book is new, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation. I have 3 short excerpts. I'm hoping that 3 of you will volunteer to read for me. And in return for reading it, I can promise bags of M&Ms. But I'll give you a few minutes to think about whether or not you're brave enough to come up here and try and read through luckily it's not my penmanship, it's my typing. You couldn't read my writing if it was my actual writing. So I'm going to begin by talking about the rise of the OSS. And it was an organization founded by this man, William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan had been a Republican activist. He had been a World War I hero. He was a corporate attorney. And during World War I, he had been a Marine. And so when Roosevelt was deciding in the late 30s and early 1940s that he needed better information about what was going on abroad, he decided who better to recruit than a political rival, William Donovan, that if he brought in this Republican corporate leader, that would help demonstrate the bipartisan nature of his foreign policy. And one of the things that was going on was J. Edgar Hoover, get my Hoover right, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was very reluctant to see Roosevelt create a foreign intelligence agency. J. Edgar Hoover wanted to be in charge of all intelligence. And so for Roosevelt to get this done, he had to bring in somebody who was above suspicion, at least with the Republicans in the FBI and in the Senate. And so William Donovan was his guy. Donovan was also an Irish Catholic, which helped because it helped sell the war when Joe Kennedy, the ambassador to the UK, another Irish Catholic, John's father, he had been very reluctant for the US to intervene in World War II. And so bringing in a different Irish Catholic to try to make the case for intervention was a smart tactic on Roosevelt's part. So what Roosevelt tasked Wild Bill with doing was creating the outline for what would be a foreign intelligence agency. And so in the summer of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Wild Bill puts together this proposal for what becomes the Coordinator of Information. And that was the first foreign intelligence agency developed in the US. Right after Pearl Harbor, then Roosevelt went and expanded Donovan's mandate. He realized that it was going to be extremely important to build this foreign intelligence agency. And so what Donovan did was went right to work trying to recruit agents, trying to recruit people he could use to help build what becomes the OSS. So in 1942, Roosevelt expanded the mandate and changed the name to the Office of Strategic Services. So I'll call it the OSS throughout. To build the OSS, Donovan recruited people from many different walks of life. Most of them were from elite social circles, as was Donovan. They were lawyers, they were labor leaders, they were businessmen, they were soldiers. There was a joke going around that the OSS stood for Oh So Social. Because the idea was that it was just a gentleman's club, and in some ways it was. And one of Donovan's early recruits was Allen Dulles, who would of course go on to become director of the CIA. Dulles was extremely important in recruiting missionaries, and I'll talk about him more a little bit later. But the other thing that they recruited was missionaries. And this is the part of the story that nobody has known about. This is the part of the story that was hidden, that was covered up since then, and that I've spent the last 5 or 6 years buried in the archives trying to unearth and trying to make sense of. And what I discovered is that missionaries make excellent spies. Oh, sorry, I missed this. I forgot about this slide. I put in Roosevelt. We're in the Center for Presidential History, and I was afraid Jeff would kick me out if I didn't at least put up a picture of one president. But missionaries make great, great spies. I'm going to come back to Roosevelt in just a second. But they have a particular skill set, right? If you think about what makes missionaries effective, what do? You realize that what they do is very similar to what a spy does. They learn foreign languages really well. They learn how to immerse themselves in other cultures. They learn how to blend in. And they learn how to try to shape that culture, to change that culture from the inside out. So these are all things that missionaries worked on generation after generation after generation for benevolent purposes, for good, to spread the Christian gospel or whatever it is they were trying to spread. But these skills, Donovan soon realized, could also make them extremely effective for foreign intelligence work. They were also some of the few groups of Americans that Donovan could draw on. There weren't a lot of Americans who knew a lot about foreign cultures. There were a handful of elite folks, and those were people that Donovan also recruited. But he stumbled upon the fact that missionaries could play an important role. What motivated missionaries, though? Why would they do this? Why would they risk their careers, risk their work for the sake of the war effort? Well, that's where we do come back to Roosevelt in his articulation of the four freedoms. Roosevelt tried to explain to the American people why the U.S. was fighting, what was so important, what was it that was going to motivate them to be willing to risk their lives or to risk the lives of their sons or their families. And one of those things was freedom of worship. And this is Norman Rockwell's depiction from the Saturday Evening Post of Roosevelt's articulation of the freedom of worship. Roosevelt made the case really beginning in 1939, even before the war began in Europe, but as he could see the war, the storm clouds developing, that central to democracy around the world was the freedom of religion. And this was something that Roosevelt really believed and seemed to really articulate over and over and over again. And so by 1941, when he's crafting the OSS, when he's launching the OSS, missionaries understood and they recognized that an American victory was essential to their work abroad. There had been generations and generations and generations of missionaries working in China. If Japan took over China, this put all of their missionary work at risk. There, of course, had been generations of missionaries working in Europe as well and in North Africa. If Hitler took over Western Europe, if he took over North Africa, then this would jeopardize missionary work there as well, too. So for missionaries, there was a clear motivation. If they served the OSS, they might do some things they weren't comfortable with, some things they might not like, but ultimately this would guarantee, this would ensure the survival of the work that they had done, that their families had done, and that their churches had done. And so for them, they knew they had to win the war to protect their own work as missionaries and as religious activists. The problem, though, and the reason why this story was covered up was because the missionaries themselves didn't want it getting out, for obvious reasons, right? If you know that one missionary works for a secretive clandestine government agency, how do you know that every missionary is not actually working for that secretive clandestine agency? So as soon as the war ended, Wild Bill went out of his way to erase the role that missionaries had played in the OSS. The missionaries themselves did that as well. Most of the material I found was with the missionaries, the direct correspondence with the missionary executives was in declassified OSS papers in the National Archives. And American leaders in the 30s and 40s always kept carbon copies of their letters. So missionary executives would keep copies of everything they sent, especially things they were sending back and forth to government agencies, not with the OSS. That all of the letters I found in the National Archives had been erased from the Presbyterian Missionary Archives, from the United Churches of Christ, from the Christian Missionary Alliance, from all these other organizations. It was clear that as soon as the war was over, the missionary agencies wanted to sort of move past this history and make sure that this was a story that wasn't told. And we can talk some about that at the end in your questions and answers. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the particular folks themselves. And what I do in the book is talk about the missionaries whose stories I could learn the most about. And so these are people in which I had good materials from the OSS in terms of their operations, what they were actually doing as spies or intelligence agents. And there were also people who had an independent, separate paper trail in other archives so I could reconstruct their private lives, their personal lives, their religious lives, their family lives. In this, the family stuff and the operational stuff is completely different. Like they're not writing to their families about their operational stuff, and they're not talking about their spiritual crises in their OSS stuff. But everything is dated. And so what I was able to do was essentially put together the puzzle, take the personal letters and the operational materials and figure out what was going on in their lives and how they were wrestling with and the kinds of questions they were asking and what they were trying to do. So I'll talk first about my favorite character in the book. Actually, this is not my favorite character. This is a slide that I was going to show. This is a missionary's diary, but you can just see from the picture itself, missionaries are constantly trying to embed themselves in culture and to understand the culture, and this is what made them such effective spies. But here's Bill Eddy. So Bill Eddy was in his mid-40s when the war began. I like him a lot. He had 4 children. This is his wife and his 4 kids. He was extremely worried about his family during the war. Both of his boys ended up serving in the Pacific and the Marines by the end of the war. His older daughter ends up being a secretary in the OSS. But what I found reading his letters, which were at Princeton, was this was an amazing family man, an amazing father who really cared a ton about his kids and about the war and about the war effort. But let me back up and tell you a little bit about why he got involved with the OSS. He was actually born in Beirut. His parents were missionaries at the American University there, and he lived in Syria until he was 15 years old. He never came to the US until he was a teenager. He grew up speaking fluent Arabic along with English. He knew the Bible as well as he knew the Quran. So that he returns to the US for school, for high school, and then for college. And then he decided to be a missionary himself. And he returned to the American University in Beirut in the 1920s and spent the 1920s in the Middle East. In the 1930s, he became an academic. He returned to the US. But in 1941, as he could see the war developing, he decided to return to service with the Department of the Navy. He had actually been a Marine in World War I. That's an important part I just realized I forgot to mention. He had been an intelligence agent during World War I before he decided to be a missionary in the 1920s after the war. After seeing the horrors of the Western Front, he had decided that the hope for the world was the Christian gospel, and so that's why he chose to become a missionary after the war. But by 1940, 1941, he begins to recognize that once again, the world is threatened, this time by fascism and totalitarianism, in that he could be more effective in serving the Christian gospel by returning to government service. So William Donovan finds out about William Eddy. He realizes that here's a guy who speaks fluent Arabic, who's connected with major Arab leaders in North Africa and the Middle East, who also knows the Quran. And so Bill Eddy recruits him for the OSS and sends him to North Africa, where he serves as an intelligence officer. As many of you probably know, one of the first major American operations in World War II was the invasion of North Africa. So William Eddy was sent there to lay the foundations for this, for Operation Torch. And so his job was to recruit a local army of rebels and dissidents so that if the Americans pull out of North Africa, he could leave behind this guerrilla army to try to wreak havoc on the Axis armies. But if the Americans invade, then he makes sure that he's softening the ground, that he's making it possible for the invasion to take place. And so one of the things that he does is engage in sabotage. He begins to identify Axis agents, and he begins to work with Bill Donovan on a number of plans. As they move towards Operation Torch, he also becomes one of the leading propagandists in North Africa, especially to Arabs in North Africa. And so he puts together these posters, he and his agents do. And one of the things that they do is they really highlight the importance of religion to the war effort. This is a Flag Day speech that Roosevelt gave, and you can see it's printed here in Arabic and printed in French as well. Eddy spoke fluent French. He was also working with French in North Africa. And so his job was to convince these folks to support the Allies, especially because Arabs were very suspicious of the French and especially the British because they had been colonial powers. They had colonized much of North Africa. And so Northern Africans were not all that eager to support the Allies. And so Eddy's job was to try to convince them that they would have freedom and opportunity after the war if they supported the Allies' efforts. And one of the ways Eddy did it was by playing up Americans' religion. And so I found a different pamphlet, not this one, but a different pamphlet that Eddy and his team put together, which I just couldn't believe when I read the English translation. This is what it said. "We, the American holy warriors, have arrived." And this was a pamphlet that was going to be dropped at the day of the invasion. So the American holy warriors have arrived. "We've come here to fight the great jihad of freedom. We have come to set you free. Our soldiers have been told about your country and about their Muslim brothers, and they will treat you with respect and with a friendly spirit in the eyes of God. They are holy warriors, happy in their holy work." So extremely religious, extremely loaded, and that was what Eddy was trying to do. On the eve of the invasion, he was snuck out of North Africa. He flew to London. He advised Patton and Eisenhower on the landings. They had a debate about where the ship should land and how they should prepare, and Eddy was the guy who knew the most about it. When he walked into the room for his first meeting with General Patton, he was wearing his Marine uniform with his World War I decorations, and it turned out he had more rows of ribbons than Patton did. When an OSS leader asked Patton, "Do you know Colonel William Eddy?" Patton responded, "No, but, quote, the son of a bitch has been shot at enough, hasn't he?" So let me stop real quick here, and I will ask, and I hope one of you will please volunteer to come up and just read a paragraph from the book about Eddy's actions. Anybody want a bag of M&Ms and bail me out? Thank you. just the highlighted part. Thank you.
Do I get the M&Ms first?
You can have the M&Ms first, absolutely.
To orchestrate the daring and ambitious plot, Eddy hired a team of Frenchmen. His principal hired gun was the father of a boy who had been imprisoned in Paris by the Germans. The father, he noted, is impatiently awaiting permission to carry out this assignment. Eddy wanted to ensure that no one could trace the assassinations back to him or the OSS. He planned to frame the execution as a French revolt against Axis domination. In other words, he explained to Donovan, it should appear that the dead Germans and Italians were the victims of a French reprisal against shooting of hostages by the Germans and other acts of German terror, not an OSS operation. Assassination plots were not the only thing on Eddy's mind. At about the same time that he was recruiting French hitmen, he wrote to his family about the sacrifices he was making for Lent. He described the Easter season as abnormal this year. I am certainly abstaining from wickedness of the flesh, he confessed. With his wife thousands of miles away, that was not too difficult. I haven't even been to a movie since Lisbon. I don't overeat anymore, and I allow myself a cocktail at night, but never before work is all done. At the time, he was attending services at the local Anglican church.
Thank you. Grab the M&Ms. Thank you, I appreciate it. And I promise when I ask for 2 more volunteers, that's the longest passage, so none of you have to worry. But what struck me about Eddy as I was doing this research was the amazing juxtaposition that he's orchestrating this assassination plot, and that's what he calls it. That's his language. He says, we're going to take out every Italian, German, and Japanese agent in North Africa on the eve of the landings. And at the same time, he's writing home to his family about Lent, about the little ladies in the church he's worshiping with, and about the fact that they're praying for peace and stability in a greater world. And it's these kinds of moral dilemmas that made, for me, the research so interesting, was to think about these people who had been missionaries, who had put their lives on the line for the Christian gospel in the 20s and 30s, then put their lives on the line in a different way in the 1940s. So after Operation Torch, after the battle for Africa was won, Donovan put Eddy in charge of intelligence operations around the entire Mediterranean. And then in 1944, the State Department decided to dispatch him to Saudi Arabia. They were recognizing the increasing importance of oil and of the Saudis. So here's Eddy with some of his robes. These were given to King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And he got to be very good friends with King Abdulaziz and with the Saudis. And so he spent 1944 and 1945 as the U.S.'s ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and he was instrumental in crafting the early relationship between the U.S. and the Saudis. I should also show another picture. This is in a historic meeting between Roosevelt and Abdulaziz. It's a famous picture. Diplomatic historians use it in all their books when they're talking about the Middle East. Should I put Jeff on the spot? Do you know who this guy is? Guesses? William Eddy, of course. Yeah, so Eddy became the single translator for this famous meeting between Abdulaziz and FDR because Eddy was the guy who knew fluent English and fluent Arabic. And there's a great story when they go down below decks for lunch. They're in separate elevators. Eddy is with King Abdulaziz, FDR is with Admiral Leahy, the naval leader who's pictured over here. And there's a delay. FDR is slow to get to the lunch table, and so Eddy says, what the heck happened? Well, Roosevelt had hit the emergency stop on the elevator so he could smoke 2 cigarettes really quickly because he didn't want to do that in front of the king. So then Eddy complains in his letters home to his kids about how next time he wants less puritanical leaders to serve because he had been dying for a cigarette himself during this thing. So I'll come back to Eddy at the end. Shift gears now, talk about another one of the characters I found. This guy is the most fascinating, and no historian has done any work on him yet, but he's begging for tons of research. This is Stewart Herman, pictured here. He went to Europe in 1934. He had been raised in a prominent Lutheran family. His father was a minister in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He went to seminary at Gettysburg Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then decided he wanted to do some postgraduate work in Europe. He wanted to understand what was happening with European theology. So 1934, he goes to Strasbourg in France, right on the German border, to do some work on theology. And what he had become convinced about, and this was true of many other kind of liberal theologians in the 30s and 40s, or 20s and 30s, was that the key to global peace, the key to global stability, was to build the universal body of Christ, to create this universal Christian network, and that if Christians around the world could just unify, could just organize, that would bring peace and stability, and that would be the counter to fascism. So he goes to Strasbourg very idealistic, very hopeful, and very committed to spreading the Christian gospel, thinking that this is what's going to stop all of the problems that he's seeing in the world around him. Sort of a fluke, this wasn't planned out, in 1935, he receives an invitation to become the minister at the American church in Berlin. And so he goes to Berlin in 1935. So Hitler's been in power for a year and a half. So he's right there at the ground level watching what's happening unfold in Nazi Germany. The way that I discovered him was every week he would write a 5 to 6 to 7 page letter home to his parents about what he was seeing and what he was witnessing in Nazi Germany. And the letters by themselves are amazing. I mean, they reveal so much about this young American, and as he's seeing, he's constantly commenting on politics. Because he's at the American church in Berlin, he's connected to the ambassador, and he's connected to the American business leaders, as well as Hollywood leaders who had gone to Germany to kind of spread the American movie industry. And so he's kind of right there knowing the who's who of expatriates in Berlin. And he's also very curious about what's happening with the Nazi regime and its relationship to religion. And at first, he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't quite know what sense to make out of Hitler. He's sort of curious, he's sort of suspicious, but he's not convinced necessarily that Hitler is a bad guy. But, of course, over time, he's trying to understand this. So that brings us to my request for a second volunteer to read a short passage, I promise it's short, about Stewart Herman. Thank you. Thank you so much. And what's your name? Thank you. Just
Only a few months into the job, Herman had his first real problem regarding his lack of enthusiasm for Hitler. He emerged from a subway in the midst of a Nazi rally on his way to the church office. His hands were full, but everyone else raised their arm in the Nazi salute. He kept walking. Feeling conspicuous, he finally stopped at the curb. At that point, he later recalled, something crashed down between his shoulders and an angry voice asked him why he hadn't saluted. "Why should I?" he said. "I'm an American." Other bystanders joined in, verbally attacking him. He argued right back. Fuming by the time he got to the church, he shared the story with a member of the council who happened to be at the office. The councilman worked in journalism and relayed Herman's account to the Associated Press, which ran the story of the American pastor accosted at a Nazi rally. The event and the media interest it provoked earned Herman his first visit from the agents of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, who apologized for the incident. Hitler did not want to provoke the United States.
Thank you. Reach your M&Ms. Thank you. Thank you. So what ends up happening, for those of you who know anything about the kind of religious history of Nazi Germany, there's a group of dissenting churchmen called the Confessing Church who become some of the strongest, staunchest opposition to Hitler. And of course, Hitler and the Gestapo over time began to round up more and more of these churchmen. But Stewart Herman, because he's an American there, he gets plugged into the network of the Confessing Church. So he knows who you can trust and who you can't trust, who supports Hitler and who doesn't, but he tries to sort of stay above Nazi politics because he's afraid that will jeopardize his position. So I had these letters at Gettysburg Seminary, which, like I said, by themselves were enough to write about him. But I decided on a whim, and I mostly deal with dead people, but I decided on a whim to talk to a real person, which was Stewart Herman III. I Googled Stewart Herman. I saw there was a Stewart Herman III who taught at a Lutheran seminary, and I figured that's got to be a relation to this Stewart Herman. So it turns out that not only did he write these letters home to his family, he also kept a daily diary. Every single day of his life, he would fill out a full-page diary where he would explain what he was thinking, feeling, wrestling with. And this continues all the way through the end of the war. Really, it continues into the 1980s or 1990s. But his son had these diaries all in a closet, just lined up row after row after row. And he was gracious enough to let me sit in his house and just scan page after page after page of these diaries. The other thing I found, then, Stewart Herman's other son, Christopher, is in Washington, D.C., he had correspondence between Stewart Herman and his girlfriend at the time, who then becomes his wife, becomes these boys' mother. And so I was also able to read these letters, again, at the dining room table in Washington, D.C. Christopher Herman thought these letters had probably not been read since Stewart Herman read them himself in the 1940s. So I was able to put together these amazing sources with the government documents to figure out what these folks did. So I haven't talked about the OSS, though. So Stewart Herman's in Nazi Germany all the way until 1941. He's right there until after Pearl Harbor. At that point, he's interned with all the Americans who are left in Berlin. And then in 1942, he's exchanged for German prisoners. He goes back to the US. He struggles to find a job. He basically travels the country speaking about religion in Nazi Germany. And then he finally takes a job as a professor at a small seminary in Ohio. It's right at that point in late 1943 that William Donovan discovers Stewart Herman was fluent in German, but also knew what was happening with the German underground, that he was the guy who understood the confessing church and who was who within the confessing church. And so Donovan offers Herman a job. Problem was, Herman had just taken this job for this academic. And I know academics take a lot of crap, rightfully so, for being ensconced in the ivory tower and that we don't know what the real world is like and we don't ever know what's really going on. And unfortunately, this dean proves that point. He told William Donovan that they had already advertised Herman's courses and to cancel their plans would, quote, be real embarrassment. So here's a guy who knows better than anybody what's happening in Nazi Germany, and his dean is saying, no, we need him to teach these classes to these seminary students. We don't want him working for you. Eventually, they cut a deal. Herman taught for 2 months, and then he moved to Washington, D.C. for the OSS. Now, at that point, one of the OSS's main jobs was trying to place agents in occupied Europe, but they were having the most trouble with Germany. Like, you could drop people into France or into Italy, and you could count on some resistance folks helping you out. You couldn't count on resistance folks in Germany. That was a really hard place to penetrate. And so the OSS had different field offices, and they were running different campaigns to try to get people into Germany. And Donovan was worried, and the British were worried as well, that if they didn't coordinate these campaigns, they would have people stepping all over each other. So what they did was they put Stewart Herman in charge of organizing the Central European Operations Desk. So they sent him to London. He partnered with the British Secret Service and with the OSS. And his job was to hatch plans, actually to recruit agents, and then to hatch plans to get them into Germany. So the question I ask myself, and I'll pose to you all, is what does it tell us about the OSS that they take a man who's got no military experience, no intelligence experience, who's just a pastor, and put him in charge of running operations into the Third Reich? It gives you a sense of how disorganized and how amateurish the OSS was at the time, but it also gives us a sense, I think, of how talented Stewart Herman was, that he had impressed military leaders who were working with the OSS, and they recognized that he was somebody who could perhaps do this job. So he creates a series of plans. He begins shopping POW camps, looking for Germans that he can turn, that he can send back into Germany. He begins working with the OSS on propaganda. He develops a number of strategies. Some of them are pretty funny. I don't have the time to talk about, but ways to figure out how to undermine Hitler and Hitler's leaders. He also got to know Allen Dulles, and at that point, Allen Dulles was positioned in Bern. And Dulles was the one who had the most idea about what was happening in the Third Reich. And so Dulles, by 1944, has decided that the Allies are going to win the war, that this is inevitable, and that Reconstruction is going to be a major concern, is going to be a major problem. How do you rebuild civil society in Germany? And what Allen Dulles decided was that religion was going to be fundamental to that, the churches, that those were the only institutions that had not been completely corrupted by Hitler. And so what he needed, what he wanted, was somebody who could be the liaison between the American government and the churches in Germany. And so what he decided was that Stewart Herman was his guy. Let me see I can't remember this, other Stewart Herman's, his OSS papers. So what he decided was that he wanted Stewart Herman to be this guy. Well, at the same time, the global ecumenical Christian movement that Stewart Herman had been a part of in the 1930s was getting ready to launch what we now know as the World Council of Churches, this great, huge ecumenical Protestant organization, worldwide organization. And they had wanted Stewart Herman to come work for them to work on refugee issues. And so Herman and Dulles hatched this plan, which again, nobody's ever written about. These are new materials that have just come out from the CIA. Hatched this plan to embed Stewart Herman with the World Council of Churches. So he officially resigns his job with the OSS, to go to work for the World Council, but he's secretly still working for Allen Dulles. And that relationship continues into 1946, 47, 48. But he was instrumental he was one of the first civilians to get into Germany after the war and to organize these church conferences in which church leaders essentially apologize for the Holocaust, they apologize for what had happened during the war, they take some responsibility, and then they become the leaders in reconstructing post-war Germany. So that's Stewart Herman's story. And we can also talk about, there's lots more to say about him, so if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. This is the first meeting of the World Council of Churches in 1948, so Herman again was there. Third character I'm going to talk about, this is the last one I'll talk about tonight in any depth, is John Birch, who's a name you may know, but probably not for the right reasons, or at least not because of actual John Birch, but we'll talk about why you may have heard of his name. But he was a missionary. He went to China in 1940. This is a picture of him in 1940. He's on your right. Wonderful suit. Don't you have a suit like that? I thought so. But Birch was a fundamentalist, which sets him apart a little bit theologically and religiously from William Eddy and Stewart Herman. Eddy was a traditional ecumenical liberal. Stewart Herman was a Lutheran, part of the old confessional church tradition. Birch was a fundamentalist. And what that meant was that Birch believed that the world was going to end at any moment. He was looking to the coming of Jesus Christ, the second coming. He believed that the Antichrist was emerging somewhere around the world. He believed that the war was going to end in Armageddon. But he also believed that if time was running out, if the world is going to end, we need to get as many people saved as possible. We need to make as many Christians as possible. So he goes to China in 1940, despite the fact that China had been at war with Japan for almost a decade at that point. And many missionaries had been recalled. The State Department was telling Americans to leave. But Birch, he was young, he was ambitious, and he just decided he was going to do it. And he particularly wanted to work on the front lines, that he wanted to support the Chinese churches that were in the most danger of falling to the Japanese, that he felt like that was what God had called him to do. So he's there in 1941. After Pearl Harbor, he's cut off from his missionary agency because it becomes much more difficult for Americans to get money and get information into China. And so he's sort of floundering around trying to figure out what to do. He's ministering, but he's very poor, and he's very much on his own. Well, 1942 is an important month in the war. General James Doolittle led a squadron of 16 B-25 bombers off of aircraft carriers in the Pacific, which then flew over Tokyo, dropped bombs on Tokyo, and then these planes were never meant to launch and certainly not to land on aircraft carriers. And so they flew as far as they could over China, and then the pilots, the crews, all bail out. And they're hoping to be past Japanese lines, but many of them didn't know where they were and didn't know how to find the American military. So Birch is in the Chinese countryside in April 1942. He stops at a restaurant on a river. He begins speaking to a Japanese officer who is in this restaurant. The Japanese officer is talking to Birch in English. Birch thinks, oh, this guy just wants to practice his English, no problem. But while they're talking, the Chinese officer says there's some Americans hidden in a boat down in the river. And Birch thinks, no, that can't be true. I must have misunderstood. The guy just doesn't understand English. And the guy says, no, come see. So Birch goes down to the river, and of course he's afraid to step down into an area that he can't see. So he shouts down into the bottom of this boat and says, are there any Americans in there? At first, there was no response. Then he says it again, are there any Americans in there? At that point, one of the men responded, well, Jesus Christ. Because of Birch's southern accent, he goes on to say, nobody could speak American like that. I should mention Birch was from Georgia. So Birch in turn quipped, that's an awfully good name, Jesus Christ, but I am not he. It turns out that was actually Doolittle and his crew down at the bottom of this boat. It was Doolittle himself. So Birch helps Doolittle navigate his way back to the American lines, puts them in touch with the American army, and that's when Birch comes to the attention of James Doolittle, who recommends Birch for service. Now, the irony here is that Birch wanted a job as a chaplain, but because he'd gone to a small fundamentalist seminary, actually in Fort Worth, probably something relevant to mention here, Frank Norris's church, if any of you know it, Baptist Bible Seminary, but because he had gone to the small unaccredited seminary, he didn't qualify for the chaplaincy. And so this person who was not really credentialed enough or credible enough to get an important job as a religious leader in the American power structure, actually becomes the guy who's super important on the ground in China, helping the American war effort. So he goes to work for Army intelligence because they wouldn't give him a job as a chaplain. And he became an extremely effective field agent, and he worked closely with Claire Chennault, the leader of the Flying Tigers, and then the leader of the American Air Force in China. And Birch never stopped preaching. Every Sunday morning, he would preach to local Chinese residents. He would also preach to the American soldiers, and he would go into the countryside to try to make sure that local churches were growing and were building. What Chennault realized was that Birch was the first American that they could embed with Chinese army units. That one of the challenges they had was that the Chinese army would serve as the ground units and the American Air Force would bomb, but communications between the two groups were difficult. It was hard for them to communicate, and it was hard to get accurate, up-to-date, current information. And so Birch was the guy, because he was already living such a grueling existence in China. He had been so poor and learned how to sort of just make his way in the countryside. He was somebody that they could embed with the Chinese, and who got along with the Chinese and spoke the local Mandarin dialects. And so Birch became this conduit. Let me show you another picture of Birch. Here he is with some, there's a picture of Birch in his uniform. Picture of Birch, he's second here on your left, with some different Chinese soldiers as well as other Allied soldiers. And so Birch was working for Chennault doing these various operations. According to one report, he could, quote, disguise himself as a Chinese coolie, even carrying a load from a bamboo pole across his shoulders. He spoke Chinese so perfectly that the natives all thought he was Chinese from another province. Very few Americans could get away with this. So his work just proved immensely valuable to the U.S. Army Air Force. Last excerpt from the book, if I can have one final volunteer, I would love to, anybody want to read a chapter? Somebody? Perfect, thank you. This also gives you all a break from having to listen to me for a few minutes. Thank you so much. Use the microphone, the highlighted passage.
One of Birch's most dangerous and exhausting job, which he undertook in the summer of 1943, was sneaking across hundreds of miles of territory and past the Japanese lines in order to rendezvous with Chinese guerrillas. For this mission, he dressed as a Chinese peasant in order to blend better into his surroundings. He covered 300 miles by foot. According to one report, he walked between 20 and 30 miles a day, climbing 6,000 to 8,000 foot mountains in tremendous heat. During the trip, he learned that the Japanese were securing much-needed resources from nearby iron mines. Birch provided the intelligence necessary for Chennault's pilots to destroy these mines. According to a report from the field, the missionary had a, quote, satisfaction of watching, unquote, the first B-25 bombers hit their targets before he scrambled away. Mines were not all that Birch found. While operating behind enemy lines, the missionary discovered a large Japanese munition dump and garrison that the Americans did not previously know existed. The Japanese had stationed between 10 and 20,000 men there. From a nearby hillside, Birch studied the village through a pair of binoculars. He identified the officers' quarters and hidden location of munitions. He returned to his base with this information. American aviators proved unable to find the secret camp, so Birch joined the crew of a B-25 bomber and rode in the nose of the lead plane. From the sky, he was able to pinpoint the target. American bombs rained down on the village, lightening up the munitions dump.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, grab your M&Ms. Thank you. No more volunteers. I really appreciate the three of you. So Birch became instrumental in what happens in 1944 is the OSS takes over intelligence operations in China. And so that's when Birch then goes to work for the OSS. But because of his efforts, He is decorated with the Medal of Honor. Here he is with Claire Chenot getting the medal pinned to his chest. He ends up being instrumental in liaising with Korean dissidents, Koreans who had fled the Japanese lines, and becomes really important in the Chinese operations for the OSS at the end of the war. War ends, of course, in August of 1945, but it didn't end for Birch. And he had refused to take a vacation. He had refused to take any leave time. He had been on the ground the whole time, and he just believed the war needed to be fought to the end, that he wasn't going to take time off. And so what happens at the end of the war is the OSS sends him out on a mission, and it's not entirely clear what this mission was. It was probably to recover records before the Japanese destroyed them, although there's some debate about what the purpose was. But in the course of this mission, he keeps encountering Chinese communists. And of course, the Chinese had been divided between the communist movement and the nationalists, and they had organized together for the purpose of defeating the Japanese, but there were tensions. And Birch understood that. He knew the politics of the region. But in one of these encounters, he ends up getting into an argument with the communist Chinese who tell him they need to disarm him, they need to take away his weapon. And he refuses to do that. And so they ended up shooting and killing him. And so I won't leave this picture up for long, but that's a picture of, his mutilated body. He was killed, and so he essentially becomes what some people have called the first martyr of the Cold War. So the reason you may know the name John Birch is because of the John Birch Society, which was founded in the 1950s, this far-right anti-communist organization. It was named after John Birch because the argument of the founder of the John Birch Society was that if Americans had understood in 1945 what the communists had done to John Birch, then the Cold War would not have unfolded the way it did. Americans would have been more aware of the communist threat and the communist threat in China. So that's why John Birch's name continues to live forward, even though he died in 1945. So a few of the other folks I talk about in the book, Stephen Penrose, he was a missionary executive. He was positioned in Cairo, and he was one of the folks who recruited many other missionaries and sent them into Eastern Europe and around the Middle East and in North Africa as agents, and he overlapped with Bill Eddy a number of times. This is one of my favorite characters. This is Nelson Glick. He's a rabbi. He's part of the Reform tradition. He's also an archaeologist. He was running the American School for Oriental Research in Jerusalem. He was also working for the OSS, was an extremely heavily guarded secret. Every document that he sent to the OSS had a pseudonym. He had a different name, Tom Hicks. And it took me a couple of years in the archives before I realized Tom Hicks was Nelson Glick. Because in 1944, Nelson Glick published an article in National Geographic magazine, this huge article, cover story, where he thinks he's discovered King Solomon's mines from the Old Testament. And so while he's fronting as an archaeologist, he is secretly the guy on the ground helping keep tabs on what's happening in Palestine. And he's the conduit between the OSS and the Jewish agency, the Zionist group that's working out of Jerusalem in the war effort. I also talk about Father Felix Morleone. He was a Belgian priest who had a journalistic network before the war. He had sources all over Europe. Donovan also recruited him to work for the OSS. And then in 1944, once the Allies drive the Axis powers out of Rome, they send him to the Vatican, and he's their secret source in the Vatican. So he's reporting back to Donovan on everything that's happening in the Vatican, what's happening with the Pope. So I've only talked about the Protestants today for the most part, but there are also Catholics and Jews that are very important to this story. And of course, Muslims indirectly in the way that William Eddy and Stephen Penrose are working with various Muslim leaders. So after the war, two of the characters, Stephen Penrose, who I mentioned briefly, and William Eddy, go to work for the Department of the Navy and for the State Department, respectively. Eddy becomes the aide to Dean Acheson. Stephen Penrose becomes the aide to William Leahy, and they both are central to crafting the policy papers that become the CIA. They both testify with their bosses before Congress, and they both help make the argument that the CIA should be independent of the military and that American leaders should be able to disavow agents because they believe that agents needed to have the freedom to work outside of the law when necessary, and that it was important that the political leaders and the military leaders could separate themselves from the CIA. So things that today are very controversial about the CIA were in fact built into the CIA by these well-intentioned missionaries, which I think is one of the ironies that I found in the book. The other thing, then they both end up quitting government work in 1948. They were both staunch Arabists. They did not want Truman recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. and so they both leave government work at that point. Penrose becomes the president of the American University in Beirut, and he decides that it has lost its Christian foundations, and so he wants to restore its Christian mission. Eddy goes to work for Aramco, the Arab American oil company, but he continues to believe that this is part of his missionary effort, which is obviously a little self-serving, but he says it's part of the social gospel, bringing modernization to the Middle East. But the interesting that happens with Eddy is that he wrote a memoir that he never published in the 1960s, in which he asks he kind of reflects on what he had done during the war. And he said that nobody who worked for the OSS or the CIA could ever again be, quote, an honorable man. And then he goes on to say, we deserve to go to hell when we die for the lies and manipulations that had characterized their lives as spies, for the death and destruction they had wrought on their enemies. But then he asked himself, would I do it again? And he said, yes, in wartime I would. But that melancholy conviction does not make it easier to live with myself. And he said it most directly, but I also found with Penrose, with Birch, and with Herman, all of them had reservations about what they had done in the war. All of them regretted it, but all of them believed that they had to do it for the greater good, that it was necessary to protect the United States and to protect American missionary efforts and to protect those people who were most vulnerable to the Axis powers. So I'll just finish by talking briefly about where we are today. This is, of course, inscribed in the wall of the CIA entryway, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This was inscribed in the wall on order of Allen Dulles, one of the founding fathers of the OSS. What Americans discovered for the first time in 1975 was that the CIA was continuing to employ American missionaries and priests for covert operations abroad. Mark Hatfield, the senator from Oregon, tried to put a stop to that. Later President George Herbert Walker Bush, his first act as director of the CIA was to forbid the CIA from engaging in efforts to recruit or to pay missionaries. And so that seemed to settle the controversy in 1975, 1976. We discovered in 1996 that the CIA has always maintained the right to waive that rule. So the CIA, yeah, exactly. Most recently, the current CIA operational guidelines, which were declassified in 2016, so the most recent set we have, which were written in 2013, the CIA still maintains the right to hire missionaries for clandestine work. And so that's where we're at today, is the CIA probably does it very rarely, but it still maintains the right to use missionaries. And so clearly missionaries contributed to the war effort during World War II in ways that I think have not been appreciated and should be appreciated. That they contributed in outsized ways to the war effort, and they helped shape the U.S.'s first foreign intelligence apparatus. And it was because they really believed in Roosevelt's crusade to make the world safe for freedom of worship. And for them, the morals were ambiguous, but ultimately they knew what was right and what was wrong, and so they wanted to play their own role in helping make that happen. I'll stop now. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Matt. I'm sure there are questions, and if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone that'll come from either side to get to you. As always, we need the microphone to record your voices for posterity, whether you like it or not. So, yes.
The second gentleman that you spoke of, Stewart?
Yeah, Stewart Herman.
Stewart, was that his first name or his
Herman,
last?
yeah, Stewart Herman.
Did his sons know about what he had done?
No, that was one of the funnest things about this project was they had no idea what he'd done. They knew he worked for the OSS, and that was it. And so one of the first things I did was I found, so when Herman was posted to the London field office, one of the things that Donovan tried to do at the end of the war was record a history of the OSS to kind of make sure that their contributions were known. And so I had this whole long record of all of the different operations that Herman was involved in. And so I had scanned it. I was able to send it to Stewart Herman III. And so it was really wonderful I think for the families, and I also dealt with Stephen Penrose's daughter, for them to find out from me what their parents had done during the war in ways that they didn't know. And so it was, I hope and think, a mutually beneficial relationship that they were sharing family papers with me, but they were also learning more about what their parents had done. So. Other questions? Yeah, no, I don't think. Yeah, the question is how large is the CIA? I don't know. I don't think they put direct numbers on it, especially because they have agents and officers who, are all kinds of, so yeah, I don't know. The National Security Agency is huge, but I don't even know how to quantify huge.
So it sounds like the three examples you gave were really meaningful. And as that spy information came in, did the OSS recruit more and more missionaries? And how many were there?
Yeah, so they recruited a lot for the research and analysis branch, which was in New York and Washington, D.C., who are the people who are just the data analysts. So there were probably hundreds of those folks that were missionaries because, and that wasn't that controversial. Because they were the folks who just knew foreign languages, who knew, had been posted all over the world. But the field agents, and in the book I focused just on the field agents, there were probably 3 or 4 dozen of them that I could figure out, that I could identify. But the way that it happened was because Alan Dulles had actually been, he came from a prominent religious family. He knew a lot of missionary leaders in the missionary executives, and so he recruited a few. And then once he brought in Stephen Penrose, Penrose was plugged into missionary networks all over the country. So then he started recruiting more and more. And the way it worked was, if you were a missionary agency in 41, 42, 43, it was very difficult to get materials or people abroad. Right? The War Department had taken over transportation, had taken over all the supply lines. And so they would essentially engage in these quid pro quo relationships where they would sort of dangle this offer to the missionary boards, not telling them what they wanted. They would just say, hey, if you need any help getting people back to the field or getting supplies to your missionary hospitals or your missionary orphanages, let us know and we'll help you. And then when the missionary executives would take the bait, they would say, by the way, we'll do that, but is there 1 or 2 people we could use for intelligence gathering? And some missionaries said no. I mean, some of them believed that they could not compromise their missionary work, that they wouldn't lie, they wouldn't deceive, they wouldn't mislead the people they were serving, and so there were many who just said no. But obviously the story I tell are the ones who said yes. Yeah. Get the microphone.
Did the CIA route money to Roberts College and AUB and some of the other universities?
Yeah. So Penrose, when he was recruited by Alan Dulles, he was the head of the Middle East College Association, which was the umbrella organization over Robert College, over AUB, American University Cairo. Penrose had actually taught at Cairo. So that became prime recruiting ground for the OSS during the war. And then at the end of the war, Penrose began to have some misgivings because he recognized this compromised their larger post-war mission. They also got word, so Robert College was in Turkey. They also got word that the Germans were trying to recruit from Robert College, and so they were worried that the enemies were doing the same thing the Americans were doing. After the war, Penrose continued to consult with the CIA, but I think it was to this day for AUB, for the American University in Beirut, it's a complicated relationship because Penrose was such an important person in their history, but they don't want to be associated with the CIA. So there's a question in the middle.
So in the case of John Birch, what was the mechanism for communication from China to the OSS?
Yeah, so he was just dealing with the local field offices, which was running parallel with Army intelligence. And so in Chongqing was one of the main bases, and there were a couple of other places. But mostly for the operations, it was radio. And when he was on the ground, he would use radios to communicate with the pilots, the Army Air Force pilots. But in terms of the larger communication, it was slow and difficult, just like everything, as you would imagine from that time. But there were OSS officers on the ground in China who were working with the Army, and so they were the ones who were the conduits. But Birch would go out into the field, and people wouldn't hear from him for weeks. And that would be the fun thing for me reading his letters, is he would write home and say, you won't hear from me for a few weeks. I've got something going on. And then I would know from the operational stuff when he would write reports when he returned what he was actually doing. So.
I have a 2-part question over here.
There it is.
2 parts.
Yes.
First part is, in your research, did you find any of the spies who were outed, captured, or killed in this process? The second is, did you find in your research any of the supporting denominations who supported these missionaries? Did they know anything, were a part, or have any knowledge of this?
Yeah, great questions. So missionaries who were outed or found, the one that I found, there was a French recruit, a Catholic priest who the OSS had recruited. they trained him, they gave him orders, then they sent him back into occupied France. He was immediately questioned by the German military, and his first answer was, "I cannot tell a lie, yes, I've spoken to the Americans." So he was sent to a camp and was killed eventually. So there were those instances. The main folks that I dealt with, Birch is the only one that I'm aware of that was executed, and again, that was a week after the war. On the missionary boards, that was what was really interesting. No, some of the missionary board leaders knew what was happening because they were the ones recommending agents, but they kept it from the rest of the missionary boards, so that they got the most agents from the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. And the guy in charge there, he said, "We need to keep this confined to me, my secretary, and you, and not tell anybody else because they'll be uncomfortable with this." And I found that seemed to be the case. The other thing the OSS did was they paid missionaries for their work. And so they would either route the money through the mission boards, but they instructed the mission boards not to explain where the money came from, to essentially just say, "Praise the Lord is beneficial," was the line. And, yeah. Or they would pay the missionaries directly in the field so that the money didn't even have to run through the board. There's a few questions back there.
Did you mention that General MacArthur was the one that requested missionaries at the time of, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, to go to Japan because the people were in great need there and there were people homeless living in caves? Did you mention that? I didn't hear.
No, I didn't mention that. No, and I didn't deal as much with MacArthur and with the Army or the Navy for that matter, because they did have a number of missionaries, and also missionary children had been really active recruits because they also, many of the kids, the children of missionaries grew up speaking foreign languages. And so there were a number of those folks as well. But no, I just focused on the OSS and the way that it unfolded with the missionaries.
Know that the encounter was one. Is there any evidence you found that the OSS, the CIA, funneled money to support any specifically religious or missionary types of publications anywhere?
Yeah, I didn't find evidence on publications, but they certainly supported Christian organizations, especially in Latin America, kind of fighting communism. That was in the 1950s and 60s in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and other places. It's clear, and again, it's very difficult to get at CIA operational stuff. I initially thought I might write this book about the CIA, and then I just hit so many roadblocks and realized that much of the World War II stuff had just been declassified, so it made sense to do that. But no, there's no doubt that the CIA has funneled money into religious agencies around the world that served American purposes.
So I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question, which I guess means you don't have to answer. But it's kind of an academic question, but you're the perfect person to ask. I realize you need a shorthand for framing the book, but I'm curious what the operative definition of missionary is.
Yeah.
Because, for lack of a better example, Rabbi Glick is probably not evangelizing.
No.
So how did you work out what would be included in this book and what would not?
Yeah, so the better title would really be religious activists, but the majority of them are missionaries or missionary connected. But I didn't want it to just be about Protestants. I wanted to acknowledge that there was other parts of the story. So in the case of Rabbi Glick, he is working for Stephen Penrose. And so, the roundabout argument is it's the missionaries who understand the importance of religion, and so they're the ones who recruit Rabbi Glick and realize that it's important to have this outreach to Zionist Jews. But yeah, it's mostly missionaries, but not entirely missionaries. And actually, I could have vetoed it, but the publisher came up with the very straightforward title of The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War, right? It couldn't be any more basic than that. But yeah, they just decided that was the best shorthand.
It's good to follow the publicist, I have to say.
Apparently, yeah.
Well, let me thank you all for coming. Let me thank Jim Falk and the World Affairs Council in particular for their partnership. There are, as always, copies of Matt's book available for purchase and signature. I highly recommend it. You may need a diversion from, I don't know, the news, and this would be a very good one. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time.